Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. And also, the Search for the Ancient Bauble Kickstarter has launched, so make sure you go check that out. The Kickstarter campaign will last for 30 days, and after that, the playmat will no longer be available for purchase. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So the spoiler season extravaganza continues on. This morning, we got a new spoiler of Karth the Lion. That's right, we've got Garth now from yesterday and Karth now from today, and this one is potentially the new king of Super Friends. Do you like alting with your planeswalkers immediately or almost immediately? Well, then you're going to be best friends with Karth. And then my most recent episode was on another Modern Horizons spoiler with... I'm not even going to try in the name. I'm going to copy-paste the name that I think I finally got right from the last episode, and I'm going to put it right here, okay? Here you go. Asmar Namar Cat Estina Koldakar. So if I got that right last time, then I got it right this time, but yeah, the name of this commander literally takes up the entire text box at the top, so there is no mana cost. Now, as weird as this spoiler might be, it might not be as weird as another one from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Because this one mentions a mysterious type of new mechanic, I assume, that we have never seen in Magic, and it sounds pretty spicy. I gotta be honest, when I first saw this card spoiled, I thought that it was a prank. But apparently it's not, so here we are. Apparently Adventures in the Forgotten Realms just got jealous that Modern Horizons 2 is getting so much attention now, and that Modern Horizons 2 is doing a bunch of weird things, so they're like, hey, here's a weird thing and we're not going to explain it. So here you go, speculate on it. Which is exactly what I'm gonna be doing on this episode. So let's talk about Cloister Gargoyle, the mechanic, and what it could potentially be. Now, we've actually already seen a couple of cards from the Dungeons & Dragons Adventures of the Forgotten Realms set. And the official spoiler season for that set does begin at the end of June on June 29th, if I've got my dates correct. But out of all these spoilers that we've seen, Cloister Gargoyle might be the most unique one, and that's not just because of the art treatment, because we have seen that art treatment before as well. Though it is fantastic art treatment, I just want to say I really like the look of this and the other cards that I've seen like this. Regardless, art treatment aside, let's get into the actual card to talk about why this one is unique and what makes it interesting. So, Cloister Gargoyle is a 0/4 artifact creature gargoyle that costs 2 and a white. When it enters the battlefield, venture into the dungeon. And as long as you've completed a dungeon, Cloister Gargoyle gets +3/+0 and has flying. Now, the phrase venture into the dungeon does not show up on any other card that we've ever seen in Magic's history. You know, unless I'm misremembering, or if I've done my Scryfall search incorrectly, which if I have, my apologies, please let me know in the comments below. But to my knowledge, this is the first time that we're ever seeing this phrase on a card. So the first question is, well, what does that exactly mean? What does venturing into the dungeon mean? Now, unfortunately, this card didn't come with reminder text to just let us know, you know, what that dungeon is, because, hey, Cloister Gargoyle, I forget what venturing into the dungeon means. Could you explain that to me? Unfortunately, it doesn't do that. So, due to that lack of explanation, we must speculate. Now, the second part of this card kind of gives us a slight hint as to what a dungeon might be. Because again, that second part says, as long as you've completed a dungeon. So a dungeon is something that we apparently have to complete. And it does say a dungeon, not the dungeon. So either there are multiple kinds of dungeons that we can potentially go into, or they're just saying that you can complete a dungeon multiple times. Now, my guess is as good as yours as to what this entire dungeon mechanic might be, but I'm really excited about it. Now, when it comes to cards that reference dungeons in Magic, there's one that actually stands out and is pretty interesting. And that would be the very silver border Enter the Dungeon. This card is originally from the Silver Border set Unhinged, and then it was reprinted in Unsanctioned. Regardless, because it is Silver Border, it is most definitely not legal in a format like Commander. That being said, it's somewhat of an interesting concept for what a dungeon might be. Enter the Dungeon is a sorcery that says players play a magic sub-game under the table, starting at 5 life and using their libraries as their decks. The winner searches their library for 2 cards, put those cards in their hand, then shovels their library. Now, I probably lost you when I said play under the table, or maybe just the entire thing, but stick with me here, okay? Bear with me for a minute. Now, I highly doubt that Venture into the Dungeon is an actual sub-game against another player like it is in this card. I mean, Charizard is banned everywhere for a reason, even in Legacy and Vintage. Playing a Magic sub-game against another player would take far too long for a lot of reasons. You essentially would have to finish that sub-game to actually get back to the regular game, and I'm sure there'd be a lot of shuffling involved as well, so yeah, no thank you. What it could be, though, is somewhat of a sub-game just for one player, the player that ventures into the dungeon themselves. Maybe it's a separate stack of cards that you draw from separately, and maybe that's, either a monster you have to defeat in the dungeon, or a trap, or something like that. You could roll a dice or flip a coin to determine the outcome, and then maybe if you do that correctly, then you've completed the dungeon. Or maybe you have to complete a few of them, or draw a certain card. I don't know, that's just my immediate thought on this kind of concept. In fact, another card that is somewhat similar to Cloister Gargoyle, and in which it is very reminiscent of, is Steamflogger Boss. This card showed up all the way back in Future Sight, and it's a 3/3/4, 3 in a red, and it says other rigger creatures you control get +1/+0 and have haste. And then if a rigger you control would assemble a contraption, it assembles 2 contraptions instead. Now, much like the Gargoyle doesn't tell you what venturing into the dungeon is, Steamflogger Boss didn't tell you what a contraption was, or what assembling one meant. And back in 2007, when Future Sight came out, there were no contraptions. In fact, players had to wait over 10 years for Unstable to come out to actually find out what contraptions are. According to MTG Wiki, all contraptions are artifacts that begin the game in the contraption deck until they get assembled. So this is a separate deck of contraption cards that you can actually utilize as soon as you start to assemble contraptions. They also have other mechanics as well involved with this, like reassemble and crank, but I'm not going to get into all this because you know what? This is not an episode on contraptions. Though, yes, this is a mechanic from an Unstable set that actually was just referenced in an actual set with Future Sight, there is some comparison to the Venture into the Dungeon. Or I should say, potential comparison. Again, there could be a potentially separate deck of dungeon cards that you only get into as soon as you venture into the dungeon, and then you can complete the dungeon in one way or another. And then once you do so, you get benefits for having done that. Now, that's just one idea, and I'm not done quite yet. So my next idea is much simpler, and that's that the venture into the dungeon mechanic is going to be like the Ascend mechanic. As you can see on Arch of Araska, it's a land that has Ascend, which says if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. The card has a function without the City's Blessing in that you can tap it for a colorless, but once you have the City's Blessing, you can pay 5 and tap it to draw a card. So essentially, getting the City's Blessing gives you extra benefits on certain cards once you meet the requirement from Ascend. So, venturing into the dungeon could be a different requirement. Maybe that's a certain number of cards in your hand, or your graveyard, or spells cast in a turn, I'm not sure. But again, once you do meet that requirement, then you have completed the dungeon. Now, I could be wrong on this, but I actually think that this direction might be less likely than the initial one that I talked about. Because the Gargoyle says venture into the dungeon, I anticipate that you've got to actually go do something. Whereas Ascend is a simple one-word mechanic. But I could be wrong, and maybe this is the direction. Regardless, again, it is going to be somewhat similar to having the City's Blessing, because again, once you complete a dungeon, then you get certain benefits on cards. Now, when thinking through venturing into the dungeon, another mechanic that came to mind was Adventure, which you can see on Beanstalk Giant. Essentially, it's a spell subtype on a different card. So you can cast the Adventure, and then this thing goes on an adventure, and it's exiled. Then you can cast the actual thing from exile. Now, obviously, going on an adventure is going to be different than venturing into the dungeon, because this is all just on one card, and the dungeon is not. Regardless, I thought I'd bring this one up as well, just in case. And the other mechanic that at least word-wise sounded kind of adventurous to me and like venturing into a dungeon was Explore. As you can see on Path of Discovery, when a creature explores, you reveal the top card of your library, you put that card in your hand if it's a land, otherwise put a +1 counter on the creature, then put that card back or put it into your graveyard. Now again, the main difference here is that on Cloister Gargoyle, it says when it enters the battlefield, venture into the dungeon. It doesn't say that Cloister Gargoyle ventures into the dungeon. So to me, that means that you, the player, are venturing into the dungeon and not this creature. So there's a difference between that and something like Explore or Adventure. But as for now, that's all of my ideas on what venturing into the dungeon might be. And actually, I really can't wait to find out exactly what it is and how close or how far off I was. And especially if it is a separate pile of cards, that's going to be very interesting for Commander. Because up to this point, the Rules Committee really hasn't liked outside the game things and has decided not to include them in Commander. We saw that in Strixhaven when the Lessons Commander ruling came out and Lessons were essentially not allowed in Commander. Or I should say, they weren't allowed outside the game in Commander. You can still use them in a deck, you can't just use them, when you learn. So that learn mechanic from Strixhaven essentially works differently in Commander than it would in a format like Standard. So I'm wondering if a similar ruling might happen if that separate dungeon deck is actually a thing. But again, who knows, I could be really wrong on this, and in fact, I probably am. But for now, I'll leave that up to you to decide. So, in the comments below, I would love to hear from you. So, let me know what your thoughts on the venture into the dungeon mechanic are. Do you think I'm close? Do you think I'm really far away? Or do you have a completely different idea as to what it is? And of course, as always, thanks again, and have a good one.